One of these changes already came and went for an entire winter without anyone officially deciding to bring it back. Another one is written into the sport's own labor contract and has survived every single negotiation since. The steroid era ended as a specific scandal decades ago, but it left behind a genuinely uneven trail of consequences, some of which have already quietly faded and some of which look like they're never going anywhere. We ranked 5 lasting changes from the steroid era by how permanently they actually stuck. The moral outrage, least permanent. Start with the loudest reaction at the time and the one that's faded the most since. In the mid-2000s, the public mood around performance-enhancing drugs in baseball was somewhere between betrayal and fury. Congressional hearings, magazine covers, a genuine sense that an entire era of the sport's biggest offensive numbers couldn't be trusted. That specific intensity of outrage simply doesn't exist at the same level today. The two moments that defined that fury both happened in the same March 2005 congressional hearing. Mark McGwire, sitting in front of the cameras, refused to directly answer questions about his own past use, repeating some version of "I'm not here to talk about the past" so many times that the phrase became a kind of national punchline almost immediately. Rafael Palmeiro, at the same hearing, jabbed his finger at the panel and flatly denied ever using steroids, only to test positive himself just a few months later that same season. Those two moments, more than almost anything else from the era, became shorthand for the entire scandal's mix of denial and disgrace. Plenty of the same players once treated as villains have since been welcomed back into the sport in ceremonial roles, invited to alumni events, and discussed by fans with a tone closer to complicated nostalgia than genuine anger. The passage of time did what no rule change could. It softened a reaction that once felt permanent into something closer to a well-worn historical grievance, the kind people can still argue about without the visceral heat that defined the original moment. Part of what accelerated that softening is simple generational turnover among the fan base itself. A meaningful share of today's viewers were either too young to experience the original scandal firsthand or weren't following the sport closely enough at the time to form the same visceral reaction older fans did. For a large chunk of the current audience, McGwire's evasive testimony and Palmeiro's finger wag aren't a personal betrayal they lived through. They're a historical clip they've only ever seen secondhand, discussed with the same detached curiosity as any other decades-old sports controversy. The media conversation itself has shifted accordingly, from moral condemnation towards something closer to academic or nostalgic retrospective. Documentary specials and anniversary retrospectives now treat players like McGwire and Sammy Sosa with a tone of complicated fascination rather than outright scorn, a framing shift that would have seemed unthinkable to anyone reading the newspaper coverage from the height of the actual scandal 2 decades ago. Compare that trajectory to how the sport has handled other historical controversies and the pattern becomes clear. Outrage, even genuine and widespread outrage, tends to be the single least durable reaction any scandal produces, precisely because it requires constant emotional energy to sustain. The steroid era's moral panic burned white hot for a few years and then, like every comparable moment in the sport's history before it, simply ran out of fuel once the news cycle moved on to other stories. Congressional and political involvement. One level more durable, but still fading. In 2002, senators publicly told the league and the players' union in an open hearing that a real drug testing program needed to exist by the next round of labor negotiations, or Congress would consider legislating one itself. That pressure directly shaped the first steroid policy the sport ever adopted, and further congressional hearings in the years that followed kept the political spotlight on the issue well into the mid-2000s. The March 2005 hearing remains the high watermark of that political involvement, and the witness list reads like a who's who of the era. McGwire, Palmeiro, Sammy Sosa, Curt Schilling, and Jose Canseco all sat before the same committee, alongside players like Frank Thomas, who testified in support of stricter testing. Canseco, notably, had already published a book naming names and openly admitting his own use, which gave the hearing an unusual dynamic. One witness confessing in detail while others sitting a few feet away were denying everything. That level of direct political involvement in the sport's internal drug policy has largely receded. Congress doesn't hold regular hearings about baseball's testing program anymore, and the sport's leadership no longer operates under the same immediate threat of outside legislation shaping its next move. The political pressure did its job, It forced the first real testing system into existence, but the pressure itself was never built to be permanent. It was a specific moment's leverage, used once, and mostly retired once its purpose was served. The specific hearings themselves have become their own strange historical artifact rather than an ongoing institutional presence. Testimony that once dominated national news cycles for days, McGuire's evasive answers, Palmero's denial is now mostly remembered in isolated clips and old footage, referenced by historians of the era, rather than treated as an active political force still shaping the league's decisions in real time. Congress simply moved on to other priorities once the testing framework was in place, and nothing since has generated anywhere near the same level of legislative attention toward the sport's internal drug policy. The union's own posture shifted permanently as a byproduct of that pressure, even if the pressure itself faded. Having negotiated under direct threat of outside legislation once, the Players Association has approached every subsequent drug policy negotiation with an awareness that stonewalling too aggressively risked inviting exactly that kind of external intervention again, a lingering institutional caution that outlasted the specific political moment that originally created it. It's worth noting this entry ranks above pure public outrage specifically because it left behind a structural fingerprint rather than just a memory. The hearings themselves are gone, but the negotiating posture they forced into existence, both sides treating outside political intervention as a real, live possibility worth avoiding, has quietly informed every labor conversation about drug policy since, even in years when Congress hasn't mentioned baseball at all. That said, the actual threat has clearly diminished with each passing labor cycle. The generation of senators who held those original hearings has largely left office, and no comparable political figure has stepped in to maintain that same level of sustained legislative attention on the sport specifically. What remains is an institutional memory of the threat, not the threat itself, durable enough to shape behavior, but nowhere near as permanent as a structure actually written into a binding agreement. Hall of Fame voting standards. Here's where permanence gets genuinely complicated. For over a decade, players with even circumstantial connections to the steroid era have seen their Hall of Fame candidacies affected by voters weighing suspected performance-enhancing drug use as a real factor, sometimes keeping statistically dominant careers out of the museum entirely. No two cases illustrate that better than Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, a 7-time MVP and a 7-time Cy Young winner, both first ballot locks by any purely statistical measure, who instead spent 10 full years on the writer's ballot without ever coming close to induction. But even this one shows real signs of softening rather than hardening further. Bonds and Clemens both started their eligibility years in the mid-30s% range and climbed steadily, year after year all the way to 66.0% and 65.2% respectively, by their 10th and final writer's ballot in 2022. Still short of the 75% needed, but a genuinely dramatic upward trend that reflects exactly the kind of voter turnover described below. It's a standard that was genuinely severe for a while, but one that increasingly looks like it's negotiating its own gradual retirement rather than settling in as permanent doctrine. The voting body itself explains a lot of that movement. Baseball Hall of Fame ballots are cast by veteran members of a National Writers Association, and that electorate turns over gradually as older voters age out and younger writers, who came up covering a sport already well into its testing era, gain voting eligibility. Those newer voters frequently approach candidates from the steroid era with a different baseline assumption entirely, treating the era's context as a mitigating factor to weigh rather than an automatic disqualifier. A philosophical shift that shows up numerically in vote totals climbing year over year for the same candidates. Yet the standard clearly hasn't fully collapsed either. When Bonds and Clemens aged off the writer's ballot and became eligible for the separate contemporary baseball era committee, a smaller 16-person panel of Hall of Famers, executives, and veteran media members both fell dramatically short again in December 2022, each receiving fewer than 5 of the 16 votes needed. The same committee, in its very next cycle in December 2025, elected Jeff Kent, a player from the exact same era with a far less complicated PED history, while Bonds and Clemens again failed to clear even the minimum vote threshold. A new rule now bars them from even appearing on the next era committee ballot, pushing their earliest possible induction all the way to 2031. Individual candidacies have also forced the voting body to draw increasingly fine, occasionally contradictory distinctions between suspected users, confirmed users, and players who simply played during the era without ever being directly implicated at all. Rafael Palmeiro, one of only 7 players in history with 3,000 hits and 500 home runs, and the only member of that March 2005 hearing panel who actually failed a test afterward, fell off the writer's ballot entirely in 2014 with just 4.4% support. Well below Bonds and Clemens despite a similarly decorated career, suggesting the actual positive test carried more lasting weight with voters than years of mere suspicion ever did. Compare this entry's trajectory to the record book Skepticism ranked just above it, and the difference in permanence becomes obvious. A Hall of Fame vote is a single, formal, trackable decision made by a defined and ever-changing group of people. Exactly the kind of standard that can visibly shift over time because someone is literally counting the votes every single year. It's a measurable, moving number, which is precisely why it belongs lower on this list than a cultural assumption with no single body responsible for revising it at all. The eligibility window itself adds a built-in expiration mechanism no other entry on this list has. Candidates get a fixed number of years on the ballot before falling off entirely, which means the entire debate around any individual player from this era resolves itself one way or another within a defined time frame, a structural feature that guarantees this particular controversy, unlike the others ranked below it, has a visible finish line built into the process itself, even if that finish line for Bonds and Clemens specifically has just been pushed back to 2031. Skepticism toward the record book. Much harder to undo. The single season and career home run records set during this era are still, technically, the official numbers in the book. Barry Bonds' 73 home runs in 2001 and his career total of 762 both remain the sport's official standards. But an entire generation of fans now reflexively attaches a mental asterisk to them that no rule change or Hall of Fame vote can remove. Ask a casual fan who holds the real home run record, and a meaningful share will still name Hank Aaron, whose 755 career home runs Bonds actually passed, or Roger Maris, whose 61 in a single season stood as the record, before Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa's chase in 1998 and Bonds' 73 3 years later. That kind of embedded public skepticism is nearly impossible to legislate away, precisely because it isn't a rule at all. It's a shared cultural assumption that's had 2 decades to settle into how the sport talks about its own history. Statisticians, broadcasters, and fans alike routinely qualify Bonds' numbers with context that Aaron's or Maris's records simply don't require. A permanent asterisk that exists nowhere in the actual rulebook and everywhere in how the numbers actually get discussed. This particular change has proven durable specifically because it doesn't depend on any single institution enforcing it. A political hearing can end. A voting body can gradually soften its stance. But the record book Skepticism lives entirely in millions of individual fans' heads, passed down casually in conversation, in broadcast commentary, in the exact kind of offhand qualifier and announcer ads without even thinking about it. Bonds holds the record. Such as it is, every single time the topic comes up, there's no single decision maker who could reverse that even if they wanted to. The generational transfer of that skepticism is what makes it look genuinely permanent rather than merely long-lasting. Younger fans who never watched the 1998 McGwire-Sosa chase or Bonds' 2001 season unfold in real time are still absorbing the same asterisk secondhand from older fans, from commentators, from the framing baked into how highlight packages and historical retrospectives present the numbers. A cultural assumption that successfully replicates itself into a generation with no firsthand memory of the original scandal has crossed a real threshold. It's no longer a live reaction to an event. It's simply become part of how the sport's history gets told. There's also no realistic mechanism by which this particular change could ever be formally reversed, which is exactly what separates it from every entry ranked below it on this list. Congress could theoretically hold new hearings. The Hall of Fame's voting body could theoretically induct Bonds and Clemens tomorrow, but there's no equivalent lever anyone could pull to force millions of individual fans to stop mentally qualifying Bonds' numbers against Aaron's or Maris's. The skepticism doesn't live in an institution that could be lobbied or voted on. It lives in how an entire culture talks casually about its own record book, which makes it functionally unkillable in a way no formal policy ever could be. The drug testing program itself, most permanent. And finally, the change built directly into the sport's own labor infrastructure. What started in 2002 as a tentative survey test, agreed to only under direct political pressure, escalated within a few years into a full random testing program with real suspensions, and by 2008 had added an independent administrator specifically insulated from being removed except under narrow circumstances. It is today simply an assumed part of how the sport operates, collectively bargained into every subsequent labor agreement without serious debate over whether it should exist at all. The program's actual teeth showed up clearly once modern superstars started testing positive under it. Ryan Braun, the reigning National League MVP, was suspended 65 games in 2013 after the biogenesis investigation connected him to a Florida clinic supplying performance enhancers. Alex Rodriguez, tied to the same investigation, was suspended for the entire 2014 season, 162 games, the harshest PED penalty in the sport's history at the time. A punishment that cost him tens of millions of dollars and effectively ended his run as one of the faces of the sport. Those weren't marginal players slipping through the cracks of a toothless policy. They were two of the most decorated stars in the league, both held fully accountable under the exact same collectively bargained system this entry is describing. Here's the detail that makes this entry both the most permanent on the list and the funniest proof of exactly how permanent it's become. During the lockout that shut the sport down between the 2021 and 2022 seasons, the testing program technically expired along with the rest of the labor agreement, and for the first time in roughly 2 decades, the league genuinely had no drug policy in place at all. Nobody treated that gap as an opportunity. It was restored automatically as part of the very next agreement, without meaningful argument from either side about whether it belonged there. A policy that started as a grudging concession forced by outside political pressure has become so thoroughly permanent that even a total shutdown of the sport's labor structure could only pause it for a few months before it snapped right back into place. The escalation path from 2002 onward tells its own story about how deeply this particular change embedded itself. The first version was a survey, anonymous, penalty-free, designed purely to measure the scale of the problem rather than punish anyone for it. Within 2 years, actual penalties existed. Within 3 more, those penalties had grown into suspensions measured in games rather than fines measured in dollars, and lifetime bans for repeat offenders. Each escalation happened through the same collectively bargained process, meaning neither side could simply walk away from the framework without renegotiating an entire labor agreement from scratch, a barrier to reversal that none of the other 4 entries on this list ever had to clear. The testing program has also outlived the specific scandal that created it in a way none of the other changes quite manage. The moral outrage around McGuire and Palmeiro faded. The congressional hearings stopped. The Hall of Fame standard is visibly softening even for Bonds and Clemens. But thousands of random tests still happen every single season, across every affiliated level of the sport down into the minor leagues, run by an administrator whose independence is itself protected by the same collectively bargained structure. It's no longer really about the steroid era at all. It's simply infrastructure now. The same way a stadium's lighting system or a team's travel budget is infrastructure, built for a specific reason decades ago and never seriously questioned since. It's also the only entry on this list that neither side of the sport's labor relationship has ever seriously proposed eliminating, even as an opening negotiating position. Owners haven't suggested scrapping it to save money. The players' union hasn't pushed to weaken it in exchange for other concessions. Both sides have, in effect, quietly agreed that this particular piece of the steroid era's legacy is simply no longer up for debate, which is about as close to permanent as anything in a collectively bargained system can realistically get. That's 5 ways the steroid era reshaped the sport, from the outrage that's already faded to the policy nobody can imagine removing. Ranked side by side, the pattern is almost the opposite of what most fans would probably guess going in. The loudest, angriest reactions turned out to be the least durable, while the quiet, procedural change nobody was shouting about in 2002 turned out to be the one that actually stuck for good. It's a pattern worth remembering the next time a fresh sports scandal produces its own wave of outrage, congressional attention, and institutional hand-wringing. History suggests the loudest part of the reaction is usually the first thing to fade. The boring paperwork nobody paid attention to at the time is often what actually survives. Drop a like and subscribe if this changed how you think about the era.